Bible studies went all night long, and women would stay up in the hopes of being the one that he would take to bed with them. Every single one of us was married to David because David was our Christ, giving us the truths from God.
Those were the words of Kathy Schroeder, a woman that lived through the Waco, Texas disaster that began on February 28, 1993, when the ATF conducted a raid on the Branch Davidian compound. This standoff would last for 51 days and only end when the compound was engulfed in flames. During those 51 days, about 90 people were killed, including 4 ATF agents, men and women who were followers of David Koresh, and most painfully, children were also killed. In those weeks of 1993, this story gripped the nation, and with the recent release of the Netflix documentary series Waco, American Apocalypse, once again, people have become captivated with this story and the horrible outcome. The question that's on most people's minds is how could so many people become so convinced to give their lives for a man that took their wives and their daughters as his own and was admittedly sleeping with underage children? Well, the answer to that question is pretty simple. They believed that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ, because this is what David had taught them. This is what he really believed about himself, and you should hear it for yourself.
God speaks to me. I have a message to present. You may not believe that. If you don't believe that, then believe this. 2,000 years ago, hey, who believed in Christ's doctrine? Man had to die, because no one would believe what he had to say.
If you think about it, he actually makes a good point. Now, I promise you, I am definitely not saying David Koresh is Jesus or a Messiah, but the point he makes is valid. I mean, think about it. When Jesus was on earth, only a few people actually believed that he was the Messiah. And yet, 2,000 years later, few can argue against the opinion that Jesus, who was killed by the Roman government, is the most influential figure in human history. And when his followers went out and started spreading his message, people thought that they were nuts. That's right. In the early history of Christianity, they were considered a cult. The Christians were looked at like weirdos because they believed in a man that claimed to be the Messiah and that claimed to be God, and yet he died the death of a criminal. And to take things further, look at what the recent Netflix episode of Explained had to say about cults in the Roman Empire.
The Roman Empire referred to Judaism as a cult. Some say that certain versions of Islam are cults. Nowadays, most scholars prefer the word New Religious Movement, or NRM. Jesus of Nazareth lived in perhaps the most politically and socially turbulent era in the history of the Middle East, which is saying a lot. And so Jesus was one of at least a dozen messiahs that we know of.
So just think about that from their perspective. If we saw someone today that developed a small following, claimed to be the Messiah, claimed to be God, and then ultimately was imprisoned and received the death sentence, what would you think? Would you really believe that he's the Messiah? Yet, and I don't say this lightly, billions of people for almost 2,000 years have dedicated their lives, and in some cases, given their lives for faith in Jesus. Now, let's keep going with this. What about this thought?
Every prophet of every major religion can be considered a charismatic leader. In fact, the biggest joke in religious studies is that cult plus time equals religion.
The founders of 3 of the major world religions all claim to have received light and truth from a divine source. This includes Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Moses claimed that he got his messages in Mount Sinai from God. Muhammad claimed to receive his messages from the angel Gabriel sent by Allah. And Jesus claimed that he received his messages directly from God the Father. And David Koresh claimed the same divine revelation. Throughout the siege, Koresh kept saying that God told him to do this and God told him to do that. He believed it. His followers believed it. And just like the early Christians in the Roman Empire, everyone looking at them huddled in this compound thought that they were crazy. Koresh and his followers were so convinced that he was the Christ that they were willing to die for it, and the majority of them did. This is not much different from the life of Jesus. He, of course, taught that he was the Son of God, and he died as a result. And his followers also obviously believed that he was the Messiah and the Son of God. And church history teaches that every single one of his apostles, except John, died for their faith. And here's the point of all this. If we consider the Branch Davidians a cult, then this opens up the possibility that we should also consider that all the other religions are cults as well. And make no mistake about it, there are dozens of faith groups in the world today that are considered cults by some, several of which that have people that claim to be God, or that got direct messages from God. So, are the atheists right? Are all the religious people in the world just following the teachings of men that deceived themselves into thinking that they had divine revelation?
The premise of this debate is in some sense inappropriate because it suggests two things. First of all, it suggests that Islam is something special, and it isn't. It's not special at all. It's one of 1,000 religions or more that have existed since the dawn of humanity, all of which claim divine revelation, all of which claim perfection, all of which proclaim infinite knowledge, uniqueness, beauty, etc. So one of the things we know is, of these 1,000 religions, they all make mutually inconsistent claims, so they can't all be correct. In fact, at best, one of them can be correct.
If there is at least one true religion, how could we even prove which one it is? Because there are literally thousands of belief systems to choose from. Now it's time for confession. No, not that kind. I don't believe in that kind. But I do believe in one of these other religions, and I owe it to myself to find out if the one that I belong to is actually a cult. And I think that you should ask yourself that question as well. The Branch Davidians were convinced that they were following the messenger from God. They were convinced that they were following the Messiah. Personally, I think that they were deceived, and I'm sure that most of you think that they were deceived. But I can't just say that without evidence to back it up. And I can't just say that my religion is not a cult without any evidence to back it up. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to ask myself some hard questions. I'm about to start an investigative journey to find out if what I believe is valid. And I need you to ask me some hard questions too, to challenge me to make sure that I'm thinking about this logically. So if you're an atheist, a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, whatever, then I think you should also take the time to find out if you really have valid reasons for what you believe. And if you're open to asking yourself some tough questions, then I want to invite you to join the search as well. And in the next video, we all get to ask ourselves the same question. Am I in a cult? Hope to see you again.